Okay, hello everybody. Welcome. My name is Dan Hill. I'm a visiting professor at UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose and Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova, the Swedish government's innovation agency. Welcome to our mission-oriented innovation for cities session here tonight. If you're joining us, please say hi in the chat. I see some of you are already, which is great. I think we have about at least 100 people already signed in and listening. We're recording this session, just so you know, you'll see that in the top there. I'm seeing lots of hellos there, which is great, from all over the world. That's really amazing to see. Thank you. So we're going to do a kind of a panel format tonight in two halves. So I'm going to start in a moment by describing some of the work that we've been doing with cities in a cities bootcamp organized by UCL IIPP and Bloomberg Philanthropies. And then we're going to talk directly to some mayors from those cities. And then we're going to bring in Cllr Georgia Gould, Pooja Agrawal and Mariana Mazzucato, and we're going to broaden out the discussion to talk about mission-oriented innovation in cities generally and beyond. So in a moment, I'll ask Mayor Steve Schewel to turn on his video, but I'm going to do a little bit of introduction first. So the background for this has been work that Bloomberg Philanthropies, the private foundation of Michael R. Bloomberg, has enabled us at UCL IIPP to do, to bring together a set of cities from around the world to pull in around shared missions to test mission-oriented innovation in practice. We ran a 5-week boot camp around this, and it was great experience for us, I can say, from the UCL side, because we were able to bring in some of our mission-oriented innovation practice that's often at the national level down to the ground of cities. And I think the cities have gained a lot from it as well. We just had our closing meeting, actually, of the group there, and it was great to hear the feedback that we got from them. So before I start getting Mayor Schewel and hopefully Mayor Clark as well from Saskatoon to join us in a conversation about what they did in the boot camp, I'm just going to give a little bit of context. So Job Cohen, the ex-mayor of Amsterdam, once said, "The nation is a visceral experience only when a country is at war. Every day in peacetime, the city is the reality that people feel." Of course, some have suggested that we might need to be on the equivalent of a war footing for certain challenges like COVID-19 or the climate crisis. But what Cohen was talking about is that cities are where things happen. They're, in a sense, by definition, where systems collide. Sometimes they collide problematically, sometimes they collide happily, of course. And almost all systems collide there, even systems outside of cities, whether agriculture or tourism, in some way come together in cities or originate in cities or otherwise connected directly to cities. And whether at war or not, we can see cities moving effectively around some of these broad challenges we're facing within their own borders, their own administrative remit, but equally beyond that as well, and collectively as groups of cities as well, as we saw during COP26 over the last couple of weeks, where according to Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, cities act on climate while nations delay. And this is fortunate in a sense, because addressing climate, cities are responsible for around 75% of energy-related CO2 emissions. So we need movement here. But also we can see that while cities can make rapid progress on the emissions within their borders, they're often exporting the broader problem, not least with climate, but where emissions are often produced elsewhere but consumed in cities. But in other aspects as well, like migration or in forms of pollution or biodiversity degradation. And that creates what feminist geographer Val Plumwood called shadow places sometimes. And equally, we know that in many contexts, whether a highly centralized government context like the UK or a federal model like US or Australia, or at some point in between like European cities, there are many things beyond the control of cities which nonetheless affect them, whether that's fiscal policy or gun control or universal health coverage or foreign policy and immigration and so on. So we need to increasingly reconcile ourselves to the fact that everything is connected and symbiotic in this sense, and we have to move beyond borders, even as cities, and reconcile Madeleine Albright's comment, "We're taking 21st century challenges, evaluating them with 20th century ideas and responding with 19th century tools." So given all of that, the chance to bring together a set of leading cities in a mission bootcamp program supported by Bloomberg Philanthropies and led by UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose was a way of stress testing how we work in these different ways, working with systems, working with different cultures of decision-making, different approaches to innovation. And in particular, we looked at road testing this mission-oriented innovation process, getting cities to rehearse really what it would mean to work in a mission-oriented way. So over a rapid 5-week boot camp, and it felt very rapid at times, I can assure you, we looked at a range of things: market shaping agendas and mission-oriented policies, place-based innovation, urban transformation, designing organizations for missions, ownership and governance, data and finance, dynamic valuation and assessment tools. All of these things we looked at through the context of lectures, and then we had seminars and active kind of hands-on prototyping sessions with cities where they could start working in teams and with their own teams as well. And we're able to learn from world leaders in some of those areas like Richard Sennett or Francesca Bria, as well as people like Mariana. So it was great to see very different cities sharing ideas and issues and approaches and concerns across that network, whether that was Sofia or Saskatoon or Stockholm, and to create this kind of mutual learning environment that I know Bloomberg has been developing for many years now. So as I said, in a moment, we're going to open up the panel to bring in Mariana Mazzucato, the founding director of UCL IPP, and Cllr Georgia Gould, the leader of the London Borough of Camden, chair of London Councils, and Pooja Agrawal, the CEO of Public Practice. But first, we want to hear from some of the mayors who've been involved in the bootcamp themselves. So I think we have Mayor Steve Schewel here. If you could just turn on your video, there we go. Nice to see you. And do we have Mayor Clark as well yet? I know he was in a budget meeting until about 2 minutes ago, so I think he's on his way in. Okay, I'm just looking at the chat, sorry, just to double check. He's on his way. So I think we'll start with Mayor Schewel, actually, if that's okay. So Mayor Schewel came to Durham to attend Duke as an undergraduate in a year that I'm not going to name, Mayor Schewel, just to spare your blushes. He's a former school board member and city council member and now serves as the mayor of the city of Durham. His commitments are to issues of affordable housing, civil rights, policing and crime, shared prosperity, and the preservation of open space, trails and parks. So a broad and diverse agenda, as many mayors have to wrangle with. And I see also Mayor Clark has just joined us as well. Fresh from a budget meeting, good to see you, Mayor Clark. So Mayor Charlie Clark was re-elected as the mayor of Saskatoon in 2020 for a second term with a mandate to build a strong economic future where no one is left behind. He is committed to building a community where people can see each other's strengths instead of differences, and families can thrive, and children are able to see a future for themselves in Saskatoon. So again, no small mission there. So I'm going to start with you two, if that's okay. We had, as you know, a very broad range of cities working with you, from Adelaide to Reykjavik and all points in between there. And of course, you guys also got a chance to work in your teams and bring some of your teams with you. So if I could start with a question, a very open question in a sense, but beginning to share with the audience here what kind of missions you worked on through the process and how you saw the mission-oriented agenda begin to fit the challenges you're facing. So maybe I'll start with you, Mayor Schewel, just to give you, Mayor Clark, a chance to acclimatize yourself. If you could share what were the kind of primary missions that you were working with your team, and how fit for purpose was the kind of innovation practices we looked at?
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me. I want to say hello to Mayor Clark, my friend. Good to see you. And it was great to be a part of this cohort of cities that IIPP and Bloomberg put together. It was a real gift and much appreciated. I really want to thank you all for the opportunity. Like a lot of cities, we have a lot of big problems and challenges, but the one that we chose to focus on that I think is the one that really for us fit this idea of a grand challenge that needed some sort of systemic approach is the issue of gun violence. Durham is a city of 285,000 people. Last year we had 319 people shot with a gun. We had more than 30 homicides. This is unacceptable and something that if traditional if the traditional way of approaching these problems was working, we wouldn't be in this situation. We know that our traditional policy approaches have not been working. And so we needed something to think more boldly, something that think in a way that's more cross-sectoral, being able to bring multiple grassroots solutions around this problem. And so we felt that this would really be, this was the problem that we really wanted to take on with this mission-based approach.
Mm. And can I ask, I remember when we were working with you and your team, I think we all recognize that things like gun control are exactly that kind of problem that I described in my intro, where you have national laws and agendas that manifest themselves in cities, and you have a relatively limited range of policy tools available to you, I guess. But I remember we had a good conversation about the way that you might work with local grassroots initiatives with your team. And that we talked about this kind of slowly building a message through a series of small groups coming together before going public with it too early. Is that something that you want to share with people, that whether there were those moments of insight there, or how did that work out for you?
Sure. Yeah, you're so right about the national and also the national climate, and also the climate in the state of North Carolina. We have state gun laws that are make it impossible for us to restrict guns. Mm. So our streets are full of guns, and without that, so I think part of our mission has to be to try to continue to work at our state level, especially to try to get that changed. I think that turning a blind eye to that and just saying there's a local solution to this alone would be wrong. Yeah. On the other hand, in the absence of those gun control laws that are sensible, we have to take every local solution we can get. And I think that I think we can really mobilize our community around this common goal. I think that there are hurdles. There's territoriality. There is real differences of opinion, as well as difference in rhetoric about the role of policing in stopping violent crime. We have an enormous movement to defund the police in Durham. We also have an enormous a number of people who think that's just the worst idea that they ever heard. And so we got to go beyond these kinds of differences to come to some solutions that everybody can agree on. And I think there really are a lot of things. I think that, to go back to your question, there are a lot of people who are really ready to take on the root causes of this gun violence, to think about alternative kinds of responses to emergency calls, 911 calls. We're doing a lot of work on that in the city. To improve what we're doing around mental health that we know can make a difference in terms of gun violence. And so trying to broaden this beyond what's the role of the police, and that's important, but it's got to be more. It's got to be more. And I think that creating space for those discussions, getting people around the table to have them, I think can help us a lot.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I asked the same question to you, Mayor Clark, I think, because I think what we spoke about was how can you use a mission to begin to address the federal level, state level, county level, and city level simultaneously around a shared agenda, almost using the mission as an umbrella, and begin to kind of have activities running at all of those different levels. So Mayor Clark, I guess you have a very similar situation in a sense, in terms of a city working within a state, within a federal context, within Saskatchewan, and you're the mayor of Saskatoon. So how did you find this mission-oriented agenda working for you in terms of being able to combine agendas at different levels?
Yeah, well, good afternoon or good morning, or depending on where you are, everybody. I'm very pleased to be part of this, coming to you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. And for those of you who don't know where that is, we're on the prairies, or the plains of Canada, right kind of in the middle of our country, in territory that we call Treaty 6 territory because of a First Nation treaty that goes back to 1876 with the original First Nations of the area and the homeland of the Métis. I'm very pleased to join you as well, Mayor Schewel, and all of the other mayors and leaders from the municipalities that have been part of this, as well as all of the great resource folks that we had helping us along. And in our city, which was amazing to hear, whether it was in Stockholm or Durham or Madison or San Jose, the similarities that we were facing. And homelessness is one that we honed in on. In our city, we actually, one of the things that was really great about being part of this mission boot camp was that we had our assistant fire chief, our director of planning, and our director of Indigenous relations. And those are three quite different branches within the city that don't necessarily work together, and as well as myself as the mayor. And so what was really great is to look at this situation of homelessness from a planning standpoint, from the fire and protective services standpoint, and then from our lead, Melissa Cody, who is working to figure out how do we build better partnerships with the Indigenous community, because 85% of the people who are homeless in Saskatoon are Indigenous, are otherwise in the US would be known as perhaps Native American, Native Canadian. And it needs a mission type focus, because so many of the systems that have been built up for so long are just not working to help transform and create safe conditions for people. And yes, the city does not have a lot of the levers of power and the policies and the programs when it comes to housing or addictions or healthcare that are related to homelessness. We do have the power to bring the community together, bring the agencies and the partners together, and really try to put together a picture of what transformation would look like to the provincial and federal governments that we need that help from to do. And what has become so clear to me as a mayor is that those other levels of government are further away from the everyday realities that we're facing. And what our mission ended up focusing on is that even as a city, we don't really understand always what the daily reality of people who are living homeless is. And we often look for solutions that aren't grounded in that reality. And our assistant fire chief, I give her credit, Yvonne Raymer, who's on this call, really started to go and visit people who are homeless. And that started us on a track of looking at how do we transform the way we approach this by putting the people who actually experience homelessness at the center of those solutions. Yeah.
No, I think that was so interesting to see your team, Mayor Clark, wrestling with this complex systemic challenge like homelessness, where, as we all know, that relates to planning and education and health and housing and multiple other, I guess, municipal departments simultaneously, and some of those things also at the federal and the state level as well. And so the ability to focus on a system like that means that you are then able to, as you say, begin to bring different voices together around a shared challenge. And you could see conversations running across those different departments and insight from one being passed across to another. So I think, we were rehearsing that, but do you both of you, as a question, and then I'll bring in the other panelists in a moment, have you started to think about how you might be able to use this kind of mission-oriented approach outside of the rehearsal we did in the boot camp, bringing departments together in the ways that you just described, Mayor Clark? Has any of that stuff begun to materialize? Yeah, I know we were building on things you're already doing, but what have you done there in terms of after the boot camp? Has it changed the way that you're thinking about it?
Well, yes, because the crisis is unfolding, and what we're seeing is our staff are all taking a different, much more problem solving, much more looking at how do we facilitate solutions and be willing to name where those systemic barriers are and come together. In some ways, cities are usually seen as regulators, and what I see is through this exercise, our staff are looking more like facilitators and problem solvers around a lot of these issues because of a sense of common purpose and the mission that's behind that. And that even by changing the way we tackle this question of homelessness, by really taking time to understand the reality of what our citizens are facing, my hope is that it can also affect how we support issues around youth and marginalized youth and their experiences with the incarceration system, or violence against women and girls, which is an issue in our community. So it is what we've been looking at is how do we change the way we address the issue and understand what the reality of people are facing to change those systems. And I believe that will have a lasting impact on the way we approach this as a city.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it very well, this shift from seeing the city as a regulator, or, the people you go to when you have a problem and you're in the front line of all of that stuff, whether you caused it or not, through to somebody that has the first line responsibility, a direct relationship with your citizens, actually, a very meaningful everyday relationship. So Mayor Schewel, how is that changing the way you think in Durham? This is not to do with missions generally, but just a shift in the way that cities and municipalities work, more in this kind of relationship-based way, as opposed to the very transactional legislative way of the last maybe 30, 40 years or so.
Yeah, well, I thought what Mayor Clark said was absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that, when you think about gun violence, there's so much that the city doesn't control, not only at the state level. I was talking earlier about gun laws, but the courts, they're not in our purview. Social services is something that the county does. Mental health has a whole nother kind of, they're also kind of related to the county government. And so in order to make this work, we have got to be a convener. We've got to get people around the table. We have to take the initiative to make that happen. And it's got to be cross-sectoral in a way that we often don't work. And so I think for us, those are the steps that we're beginning to take now, is to try to build that cooperation and to try, as I said earlier, to get beyond the kind of rhetorical and more than rhetorical, the real differences that people have around the role of policing in solving this problem.
Yeah.
We can't get stuck with that, and we have to get beyond it, and we've got to, and to do that, we got to bring in a lot of people that aren't always working together, and so I think that's where we're heading, and I think we can do it. Yeah,
great. Okay, so I'm gonna now bring in the other panelists, if that's okay. So if Cllr Georgia Gould and Mariana and Pooja, if you could turn on your cameras, that's great. It's almost like revealing you. You've been there all along. And you have to suffer these three white men talking for a bit. Apologies for that. But so Cllr Gould, the leader of the London Borough of Camden and chair of London Councils, Mariana Mazzucato, the UCL professor in economics innovation, public value funding director of IIPP, who's hosting this event tonight with Bloomberg Philanthropies, and Pooja Agrawal, co-founder and chief executive officer of Public Practice, who does an incredible amount of work in terms of building capabilities back into the public sector that otherwise have been leached out over the last few decades. So we're going to open this up, but before we all start jumping into what we just heard, Cllr Gould, you've also been working with missions, and you're in a similar position to Mayor Clark and Schewel in some respect, in that you are also in charge of very large chunks of city, but without all of the tools to hand because of the way the UK is organized. Let's not get into that too much. But you've also been working with missions for a lot longer, actually, with Mariana and team at UCL. So in a sense, you've got a bit of a head start here, and maybe you could give us a sense of how that's been working for you, as well as Camden, which is a very large London borough. I mean, a big city by any other definition. And with some shared issues around things like violence that we just heard about, although not the US flavored, but the maybe UK flavored version of that. So could you begin to give us a sense of how missions have been working for you, what you found useful about it? Equally, we always get told to tell us what isn't working as well, which is quite right. Give us a sense of the warts and all version of it, if that's okay.
Of course. Well, really brilliant to be here and to meet other leaders who are taking this approach. Camden is a place in the heart of London, which has almost 300,000 residents and is a place of deep inequality. We have some of the kind of world's biggest companies have made their home in Camden, but we also have some of the poorest communities in the UK and even in Europe. And we have a long-term vision to ensure that the people who live in Camden have access to the opportunity in our place. But the missions approach was something that Mariana and the team really brought to Camden. We had all come out of COVID and the huge challenges we saw. But I think one of the positives, I suppose, over the last 2 years has been the strength of a shared purpose. When we knew that we had this existential challenge. We saw our services come together in ways that had never happened before, to protect people, to make sure that they were fed. We had an everyone in policy on homelessness, where we managed to get everyone off our streets. You know, that would have, you know, if people had talked about it, it would have seemed like an impossible challenge before, but with that kind of, that sense of shared purpose and support from government, as Mayor Clark said, you know, some of these levers aren't in our control. We did see transformation. And so the missions approach for us is to bring that transformation to normal business, and to look at areas of our work, and set truly ambitious targets that are measurable. So to give an example, one of our missions is that every resident in Camden will have free, healthy, sustainable meals per day. So essentially, we're trying to end hunger in our borough, but also to end food banks, to ensure that people have dignity and are able to access food. There's a climate element to that, because we know that the supply chain of food has huge carbon impact. And there's a health element. We saw the kind of depth of a health inequality. So that's massive transformation that requires the private, public sector and communities to work together in a completely different way. And I think the power of the approach has been the way that it has kind of mobilized huge partnerships that have been inspired, I think, by the ambition, but also the long-term approach, because we as a council are saying by 2030, we're going to get that. It's not all going to happen, you know, in the next few months, but we have made this deep and long-term commitment to solving this problem alongside you. So we have a network of organisations who are in that space. Some of kind of initial work coming out of it is the development of food cooperatives and communities coming together to start those food cooperatives working differently with the businesses in the borough. So we have 4 missions that we've started with. They're all at different stages, and we very much develop them alongside their community. So really quickly on what has changed, I think what has changed is I think that we have, you know, as the mayors have said, we've seen that kind of cross-sector support. You know, quite often it's seen as the council's job to fix these issues, but I think we are seeing other organisations step forward as equal partners. I think we're seeing a deepening of our community and participative approaches with investment in community solutions and ideas. And I think really interestingly for us, we're starting to see a change in our own organisation, where people are coming together in ways that they wouldn't have done before, but you know, in that long-term approach, and also starting to look at new ways of bringing investment in. You know, because if we can only solve some part of the challenge, there's other parts that kind of that we need to bring external investment. The problems and the issues, I think it's taken longer than we thought. You know, there was a lot of deep work that needed to be done to actually get people to understand the missions-based approach, to really to feel part of the solutions, to kind of understand that it was a different approach. It wasn't just starting a few new projects. We were trying to do something transformative, and I think the kind of building blocks of it took longer than we thought. And there was, you know, lots, you know, that sense of, oh, is it not happening fast enough? But actually allowing that deep work has meant that I think things are starting to really move forward quickly now.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And Mariana, I might ask you also from the other side of the fence in a way, you know, working on those missions from the UCL side of stuff. I'm going to come to you in a moment to ask your perspective on that. But I'm just interested, Georgia, that was amazing work around homelessness, in a sense, kind of pushed into it by COVID. What kind of residue has been left behind? Not that we're through COVID yet, but like, has it enabled you to fold the learning from that into the mission-oriented work? Has it affected the way, for instance, you think about food for kids in some respect? Or is there a join between those? Or was it a very tactical, reactive response that now you're figuring out, okay, how do we make this strategic once the funding has disappeared?
Yes, I think that one of what we did around homelessness was we basically took over a hotel in the borough, and we put all of our services in one place. So we had, for the first time, mental health services, substance misuse services that would usually be in hospital within a hotel in our borough, and that had, you know, really transformative outcomes. we saw substance misuse decline because actually people didn't need to go out to access services, and that made life much easier for them. We saw people registered to GPs to local doctors for the first time, and we picked up on health issues that saved people's lives. Literally, I met somebody who said he had an infection that would have killed him, but it got picked up by the services. So I think that we've taken that forward, and now those health services are embedded in all of our hostels, and that kind of community approach, I think, is something that has changed as a result of COVID. I think the challenge I'm in Lewisham Council and they've just turned off the lights. I think the challenge that we see is that government took the funding away for those people who don't have recourse to public funds, who aren't British citizens, and that is really difficult for us to find to replace that funding. And we are over winter, but that, and I think that's where the missions-based approach, we haven't cracked this yet, but I think it can really powerfully make the case to government when you have not just a council saying this is a challenge, but a range of other partners. And unfortunately, you really need, I think, that power to change government's minds.
Absolutely. It also shows the power of doing something and leading with, sort of show, don't tell, effectively, like showing that you could solve homelessness in a sense rapidly if given the opportunity is a very powerful message you can then learn from. I think it would be great to actually have Mayor Schewel and Clark and you actually follow up after this to swap stories about that one. But Mariana, you often mention the Camden homelessness scenario under COVID as a great example of an agile government being able to nimbly respond to a crisis and solve a systemic challenge which previously just seemed intractable. So this change of conditions enabled something to happen there. But how have you thought about this from a mission-oriented point of view, given that you started with this agenda very much at a sort of a national government in a macroeconomic context, and what Georgia described as right on the ground, talking about the details of individual people and their health concerns. So how do you think about this kind of scaling up and down through those different layers of governance? What does missions give you, I think, from that perspective?
So I think what's so interesting about that particular example is that what was done during an emergency was possible. Just like when we go to war, does anyone ever say, oh, sorry, there's no money, we can't go to Afghanistan, or we would have loved to go fight World War II, but sorry, we can't. Somehow money comes out of the woodwork when there's a war, and money comes out of the woodwork when we have huge crises, whether it's the financial crisis or the health pandemic. But the problem is it's too little too late. If you've actually underfinanced our health systems for decades, and then a health pandemic arises, and the ramifications of it are much worse than it had to be because of that lack of financing, that's not the right way to structure an economy. So what's interesting is learning what we do in an emergency, outcomes-oriented budgeting. No one would think of fighting a war by saying, oh, here's a bit of money for you, here's a bit of money for you, stir the soup and hope for the best. They want to win the war, right? So fighting climate change has to have that. Getting homeless people off the street has to have it as a mission, which you can actually answer yes or no. Did we achieve it? And I think the challenge for Camden is on the back of what it did during a crisis, and did incredibly well, with the wonderful leader that we have, because I live in Camden, so I'm quite lucky to have a wonderful leader of my council. How do we normalize what we do in an emergency? I mean, Italy, where I'm from, I can tell you, is not known for its wonderful agile bureaucracy. Anyway, the mafia was born out of the situation of a weak state. In Sicily, it was a Società dei Beati Paoli, which actually was formed, which later became Cosa Nostra because of the weak state situation in Italy. But what we have now in Italy is often a weak state in the sense that it's extremely bureaucratic. And yet, on the back of COVID-19, you'll remember Italy was on the front line. We found ourselves to be 100% dependent on Chinese personal protection equipment. And within 3 months, extremely quick for Italian standards, but let me tell you, it's quick for anyone's standards. Within 3 months, we used public procurement in a way that's usually just done in a war. Think in the US, the Defense Production Procurement Act, which came about on the back of the Korean War, to actually develop what is now 100% independence of personal protection equipment through 137 Italian companies. So whether it's local, regional, or national, the problem is often similar, that we think that the role of the state is just there to facilitate, enable, fix what economists call market failures. And what we've been advocating in IPP is that that's the wrong approach. What you need is market shaping, market co-creating, a much more proactive approach. And we see it in really hard times, right? Things just kick in, like those two examples I just gave, but it can't just happen during emergency. So I think the challenge now for Camden, but also for Italy, is to kind of normalize that use of dynamic procurement or dynamic tools. Georgia mentioned, for example, food cooperatives. That's such a much more dynamic and kind of also nourishing tool and institution than, say, a food bank. Or there's a lot of discussions right now in Camden about using, for example, a public fund, or of, actually nesting the clean growth mission, which Georgia talked about, within housing estates, and using new tools to get real citizen participation through, say, citizen assemblies and resident associations in that process of actually designing the missions in the first place. And coming back to the homelessness, which she talked about, where all homeless people were put into hotels, there's been, real reflection inside Camden about thinking of its assets, literally the portfolio of different assets, which include real estate, and to use it, to be kind of, people-centered. How do we actually use those, including, Georgia, the use of meanwhile spaces, which I think is such a great thing. For 18 months, you can use spaces that Camden owns for make and do, focus on areas like climate or battling different issues around inequality, learn from that, experiment, which cities and councils are so much more nimble to do. But the real challenge is, how do we learn from that experimentation, scale up those lessons, systematize them at the national and even at the international level?
That's really interesting. Thank you. And something you keep coming back to, I think, is this: you need a capability and a capacity to do that. There has to be someone with some ways of looking at the world in that way, being able to conceive of an alternative approach. You need some bodies on the ground. You need people to go and understand the problem and then make things happen. So, Pooja, this is a link in your direction, I suspect. Public practice is really, well, I think I'll let you describe it, but it's essentially about building that kind of capability back into a public sector in the UK, at least, that used to have, I'm a designer, you're a designer, a design intelligence at the core of things like councils. In 1975, 50% of the architects in the country worked in the public sector. It's now 0.7%, so that's just disappeared as a kind of a capability, and along with many others. So your amazing work has been thinking about, how do we build that back in? Because what I've heard a number of times there are really place-based solutions, understanding the ability of a hostel or a hotel or an asset on Camden's book to suddenly be repurposed as homeless housing with health services on board. So planners and architects can imagine that for sure, but only if they're actually in the council capable of pulling some of those levers. So how do you see that capability? How does public practice work in that way? Are you building up a kind of a capability for mission-oriented work, perhaps, in this respect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I start with the sort of challenges, there's a couple of layers to that. So I guess the first one is the actual capacity, so the number of people that are working in local authorities. I'm going to say local authorities, but I guess that's everyone, provincial level, municipalities, but that's true at every level, the city level as well as national government. So there's a number of years of austerity, at least in the UK, we're seeing the role of the state has massively shrunk. So there's the first issue in terms of the number of people. In that, I think the follow-on aspect, which Mariana has been talking about, is what we see the role of the public sector being in the first place. So this difference between the fixing versus shaping, and how public sector sort of sees itself as actually leading programs, delivering programs, rather than project management and outsourcing and getting external consultants, and you sort of lose that internal knowledge, that place-based knowledge, the relationships with communities, to outsourcing to consultants who come in for a bit of time, do the project and then go. So there's that kind of aspect of, I suppose, what the role of public sector is, which also, I think, means that perhaps people haven't seen working in public sector as being an aspirational thing to do. They haven't necessarily seen that as like, that would be a really great move for me in terms of my career, because I will be able to do X, Y, and Z. And the final thing in terms of the challenges, I'd say, is around the types of skills. So absolutely, I agree, design has been really lost within the UK, but actually, when we're thinking about these sort of place-based approaches to change, you need a whole range of different types of skills to solve these systemic problems. Let's, starting with sustainability or infrastructure or utilities expertise, if we're talking about retrofitting or how you bring all of those different aspects together. So in terms of what public practice does, we've designed this program, a placement program, where we bring people in primarily from the private sector into local government, into national government for a year-long placement. And along with them doing their job in their actual placements, we've also created space, which I think is really important for learning and development and sharing best practice. In a way, what I guess this program has been about bringing people, trying to solve these same problems, but doing them in quite siloed ways. And I think the sort of mission-based approach for me starts to solve some of these issues in multiple ways. So firstly is trying to think about this sort of interdisciplinary approach. So bringing different types of skills to solve a problem. There's something there around bringing the different levels of bureaucracy, power, dynamics in terms of government together towards a common problem. There's something here about culture as well, in terms of we are all in it together, trying to make this change and shifting that the sort of role from being management to leadership. I think that's really, really important. And there's something here around the importance of communication and being able to use a simple mission to bring everyone on board, whether it's a resident or whether it's a politician. And I think that's the kind of power in this mission-based approach.
So, thank you. And so I'm going to jump back to the North American landmass here on the call. What you just heard there around capabilities and cultures, some of it, I think, as Pooja points out, is this change in perspective. And I think you spoke to this very well, Mayor Schewel and Mayor Clark, the difference from being seen as a regulator, as in somebody that just says yes or no based on almost an algorithm that someone might fill in a form, and then you say you can do this or can't do this, to something that's genuinely inquisitive and exploring, that has design and other intelligences, economics and ethnography built into the practice of local government or city government. Which one for you is kind of, are you struggling with most? Perhaps you can say both, I guess, but do you have the people to hand, but it's just the perception of the city government in Canada or the US? Or is it that you can't get the people to apply for jobs in the first place because they see city administration as not particularly thrilling compared to going to work for Google or McKinsey or something? Do you have the capabilities in-house, but you're kind of hidebound by not being able to use them in the way that you can imagine? Or is it that you really are working with a kind of a crew of capabilities from previous decades that just aren't in shape for the challenges you're facing now? Like, which one is it for both of you? Maybe Mayor Schewel, I could start with you.
Sure. I think we have a lot of the talent inside city government to do it. I think that at least where I live, there's a misperception that city employees are, just sitting there, shuffling papers, filling out forms, and not, not taking initiative, and that's just wrong. Yeah. I mean, do we have the talent to do it inside the city of Durham? Absolutely, we do. And I don't feel that's the issue. I feel like the issue is many of the things that the panelists have been talking about. Our ability to pull people together, that's hard, across sectors. And I thought that what Pooja said also about across disciplines. I think that's also very much an issue. And but I don't think it's a lack of talent, a lack of will, a lack of creativity. There are a lot of things we have to do. When you turn your tap on in the morning, we got to make sure that you got all the water you need and that it's clean and it tastes good and all that. So there's a huge amount of work that just is the kind of basic core service we have to provide.
Yeah.
But in order, but being able to pull big things together and go beyond that and really take initiatives, I have absolutely no question that we have the talent and the will inside our city staff to do that.
Totally, and I think that's what I also saw from your team working with you on the boot camp. It was very, very capable people, and using the, in a sense, just using the sheer ambition power of a mission, was able to kind of lift their sights actually, and give them a freedom to think about how might we work together in this respect, because they have all of the skills there. It's really the perception of what government's there to do that I think it's both externally and internally perhaps that might be the issue. But so maybe missions has something there in that respect. But Mayor Clark, also maybe reflecting on what Councillor Gould said about homelessness, because it's something I know you were also wrestling with. How do you, were you able to, I don't want to talk about using COVID, it's the wrong language around it, but learning from COVID at that point, enabling you to short circuit a set of regulations or even just bureaucracy that previously was apparently in the way and then suddenly fell away because the problem had to be solved. Was there anything that you were able to do akin to what Councillor Gould said around homelessness in Saskatoon?
Yeah, that was very interesting to hear about how that played out as in London, as Councillor Gould described, because in the early days of COVID, in those first weeks and months, we saw a similar, just our CBO sector working with our emergency services and health transform. We had to basically, all of the frontline services and community-based organizations that served the vulnerable population had to close for their own health protections. So they collapsed and created a hub to provide services to the homeless and to the vulnerable. And it created a sense of team and cooperation that that we really hadn't seen in that same to that same degree. I think I'm interested if others have felt this. And we saw this transformational dynamic. It's been hard though, because now we're 18 months into this and people are worn out, and some of the early sense of mission and like, let's transform these systems has been difficult to sustain over time, because that sort of sense of just survival mode is set in, and some of the old territoriality and sense of competition between partners also has affected some of that long-term ability to continue to drive towards system transformation. We're still seeing a lot of signs of it, but it has been harder to sustain just because this has carried on for so long. And I feel conscious, even as a mayor, I don't want to keep throwing big, massive changes at people, who have been trying to keep the city running. And it's been quite tiring. So the seeds of transformation really did come in the early days of COVID. Now it's a question of how to be able to keep the energy and motivation up to change them, or to carry them through.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. Councillor Gould, are you having the same issue around this sense that there was a moment when you were able to pull resources together in this agile way, and then is it a question of sort of snapping back to business as usual, or is it lack of resources, or is it lack of energy that people are just sort of, can we just go back to how it was before, please, when things were in silos and it was just easier?
I think that we are definitely seeing the public sector is incredibly stretched, and there's not enough resource within the public sector, whether it's local authorities or the NHS, to meet the level of need we're seeing. So there's, COVID has exposed huge inequalities. We've seen big increases in unemployment, increases in homelessness, increases in mental health need. People, have been through a trauma of a pandemic, and so you're not seeing any less commitment or passion from staff, but people are tired. And I think it is a real challenge how we keep that purpose. Once, there was a moment where there was, I remember I was getting all these letters saying, can I pay more council tax? It's just amazing that the bins are being collected, and there was this kind of joy in public service. But I think what we're seeing now is communities' expectations have gone back up to, pre-pandemic level, and they're in their homes still a lot more, and they're saying, well, why aren't our streets cleaner, and why aren't we seeing this? At the same time, we're still dealing with COVID and trying to take a new approach. Having said that, I do think that what the missions approach does bring is it takes the focus not just on the council to deliver, but brings in other partners, and there's a huge energy in that. So I think where we are seeing our communities working alongside the council in a different way, that our staff are kind of excited and energized by that, and seeing the new resources coming in. So I feel that, I can't remember who said it, I think it was you, Dan, about lifting, you know, that process of lifting, I think, has been quite powerful. And just a real quick point on capacity, because I think we have had to change the capacity and the nature of our organisation, and we've invested more in teams that support participation, policy design, you know, that kind of central core of the organisation. And I think that has become really, really important, because if we are really going to convene, it requires like work and investment and time. And so I think that we are seeing that shift.
Yeah, and Mariana, can I ask you to come in on this question of value broadly, and just things like budgets, you know, how are they best organized around these kinds of questions when we have these systemic challenges with the budget split across multiple types of administration, sometimes different political administrations, quite often different political administrations. How do you think of a budget that would bound the system as it actually is? Yeah,
I mean, I used the word before, outcomes-oriented budgeting, precisely to kind of reflect super quickly on that, which is, if you have a problem, you can't expect it to be solved by just kind of throwing money in little places here and there, and then again, stir and hope for the best. It really needs to be seen as an intersectoral, interdepartmental problem, and with kind of money that is there in order to solve it. And we know that there's money there. That's what I meant before when I said money actually came out of the woodwork. And you know, something that's really dangerous that's happening, and I just want to say it because I think we need to battle it. And I also learned about this through Georgia, who's told me that she's already starting to hear words like burden sharing. So the money that did go to the councils or the cities on the back of the pandemic now potentially is being seen as a problem, because, you know, very narrow cost benefit and net present value calculations are being done, and worries about the deficit and the debt. And yet we know globally, even the International Monetary Fund knows this, and it's been writing about it, that austerity and cuts to public budgets have made all of our economies weaker. And it's not about big state or small state. It is about strategic, mission-oriented states, but you can't do this on the back of a napkin. You do need proper budgets. And so we've talked about crime briefly in this session. Well, you know, some of the best analyses of crime look at the social and economic determinants of crime. You know, Glasgow looked at its knife crime problem through a public health lens. So if you start cutting, or, you know, public health, if we start cutting our public health systems, we will not only make the next pandemic worse, but also issues like knife crime. You know, in the UK, for example, in the back of the financial crisis, we made cuts to public libraries, youth centers, mental health services, which, you know, have just really reduced and made much weaker our social fabric. And it's really important that the funds that have, you know, appeared, because they can appear, I said it kind of in an extreme way. When we go to war, budgets appear. The funds that have appeared for cities to deal with this crisis need to stick. We need to fight against this notion of burden sharing. So now that we've fought the crisis, now we're going to have to cut back on education, music classes, you know, a school food or whatever it may be. That is a really bad idea. And it's not only bad for humanity, it's bad for people's rights to flourish, but it's also bad for the economy. It actually costs more in the long run when you ruin your social fabric. We know that with climate change, the cost of inaction is actually greater than the cost of action. And, you know, I can talk about outcomes-oriented budgeting, and we can talk about the granularity of that, but actually the really urgent priority right now is not to go back to the era of austerity, which has very much made, again, this crisis worse than it had to be, but also is at the core of a lot of the crime that we're seeing that's increased over time due to the lack of investment.
It was so interesting, thank you. It was so interesting to be working with all of the cities here, because across that spread, we had the real range of capabilities to work with budgets. Where I am in Stockholm, you know, the income tax from individuals goes to the municipality. It doesn't go to the national government as it does in the UK, and then gets sort of drip fed back in different ways. So it's really asymmetric in that sense, national to local. It's the exact opposite in Camden, I guess, somewhere in between, I would think, in the US in different ways there. So So I think it really fascinating to see that spread, and we could see some conversations happening between cities. I'm just going to ask, I think Mayor Schewel, just maybe one last question. I'm aware of time here as well. The kind of thing that Georgia spoke about in terms of, and I think Pooja also reflected on this, shifting from being one of the questions that came in from being a fixer to a community capability builder, is also a question of trust and how, you know, citizens see their government. Do they see as you said, you have to make the water come out of the tap? That's fairly trusting, fairly fundamental. But then when you're dealing with things like knife crime or gun crime, that's far more complex in a sense. It's dealing with multiple issues simultaneously. It's not a kind of water tap problem in a sense. Do you find your citizens are trusting you as a partner in that relationship yet? How much work do you have to do to convince them, as you said, you have the capability in-house, that you would like to work with them on these things, this very different sense of community relationship? How is that relationship going for you in Durham?
I think as a local government, we are fortunate in having a lot more trust and faith in us than a state or national government does, because we're really close to the people. You know, we live here.
Yeah,
we're out on the streets every day. I mean, Durham is as I said, is a city of 285,000 people. It's pretty small. You know, I can be a lot of places and know a lot of people and have a lot of relationships, and I think that that's true for so many people in our city. So it's not that we don't have any trust building to do. Of course we do. But I do think we have, local government has a tremendous opportunity here, not just because we can be nimble, I think we can be, but also because we do have a significant reservoir of trust and belief that we can do things well. So since the water does come out and it's clean and good and it doesn't cost too much, and since the garbage does get picked up and that's effective, it builds confidence in people's belief that we can do bigger things, and we do bigger things.
Yeah, no, thank you. And horribly aware of time now, so I'm going to thank you all in a moment, but I think that was a very nice place to end it, the sense of cities are where the direct relationship is, whether it's around knife crime or gun crime or around climate crisis or the water coming out of the tap. It's cities are where those things happen. So it is actually where you can build that trust. And it's actually where you can begin to find these problems and opportunities as well on the ground and around the kind of capability building. That's what this work has been around mission-oriented innovation for cities. So thank you so much to all of you for talking about those multiple perspectives, outcomes and budgets and value, capability building from Pooja and the kind of intelligences there. And then the frontline leaders, Cllr Gould, Mayor Schewel and Mayor Clark, fantastic stories from your cities, huge challenges as well, but thank you for being so open about both of those aspects. And so finally, thanks from me. Keep an eye on UCL IIPP to follow this agenda. And thanks again to Bloomberg Philanthropies for making it happen. And farewell from wherever you are in the world. I'm sorry I couldn't get all of the questions. There were loads in the chat there. I hope some of you had a chance to look at them. Thank you. Thank you for a great session. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.